Okay, so welcome to the second public lecture organized by the Architecture faculty this year. And I will do the introduction since the Dean, Andres Ori, is unfortunately not here today due to business reasons, not because he's not interested. And so after the talk by Helena Mattsson 2 years ago on architecture and neoliberalism in the 1980s, we will continue by investigating the broader conditions of architecture, practice, and discipline. And tonight's guest speaker is Ross Exo Adams from Bard College. And Ross will give a talk on urbanization, and I guess he will question its supposed inevitability. So Ross is assistant professor and co-director of architecture undergraduate program at Bard College, and he's the author of recently published book Circulation and Urbanization. So it was published earlier this year, right? 2019. Yep. So if you have a chance, please have a look at this book, which made a really important contribution to discussion to urban studies and to discussion on what this supposedly obvious term urbanization actually is and means. And Ross has also written widely on the intersection of architecture and urbanism with geographies and histories of power. And his work has appeared in the journals such as Avery Review, Log, Radical Philosophy, and Architecture and Culture. And just one more thing I want to say is that Ross is one of few rare scholars who works across architectural history and critical writing on contemporary practice. So, and in his talk like this, he will take us back to 18th century while also addressing present urgencies. So please join me welcoming Ross.
Thank you, Maros. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to the Academy for hosting me. It's really an honor to be here and to share my work with you. So the intent I have is to give a kind of basic outline of my book and to try to situate its argument and the methodology that it's somewhat obscure or let's say unorthodox methodology within a kind of broader scope. And so I think just especially because I think all of you or many of you are students and sort of entering into architecture and seeing all the various issues that we try to deal with. A lot of the sort of impetus behind this book came from my own work as a practitioner when I, again, first came out of school and sort of started confronting certain issues. And so basically I'd begun working in a number of high-profile firms when I was younger, such as Arup, Foster & Partners, and others, whose work really had shifted increasingly toward urban design. So this is about 13 years ago, something like that. It was a moment in which this sort of eco-city and ecological urbanism had become paradigms that really drove the entire field. And as I was starting to see a kind of practice of design fed by the huge demand for this new wave of large-scale private real estate development. So urban design was suddenly happening everywhere, and in schools as well. And so I spent a while trying to kind of get my head around this new world of urban design, which I saw had really little to do with the kind of canonical history of 20th century urban design that we read and learn about in school. In the sense, real estate design, I would maybe call it, was responding to kind of a neoliberal economic set of demands in the context of climate crisis. So sort of what you might call like a soft disaster capitalism happening. So aside from many of the problems that such kind of neoliberal urban design presented, such as in certain cases the displacement of tens of thousands of people from rural lands that we would design into a project, which actually happened in one of the cases, under the guise of a kind of resettlement strategy, or the realization that climate change was seen to be best addressed by building more cities where there had been none, I finally realized that one question really stood out in the drive to design more and more urban space around the world, which is a kind of simple yet perplexing question. What is the urban? What is this thing we're building more of all the time? So it seems somewhat trivial, but also almost unanswerable in a way. The urban today, I think, is at once unavoidable, yet curiously undoubted. And I'm happy to see in some of the studio work today that people are actually asking these questions. Almost always it's taken as a given, and in that sense, the urban appears as a sort of historical constant whose presence more often than not serves as a kind of inevitable static background against which other problems gain visibility. It's often the object of inquiry, if it is the object of inquiry, its examination tends to be predicated on predominantly empirical analyses that give it consistency as a matter of the immediate present. Through documenting areas of its most rapid transformations, categorizing it through perceived abnormalities, disclosing its most extreme reach into the natural world, or more often than can be counted, by projecting urban population curves to the year 2050 or some other random year chosen. The urban seems to kind of forbid questions about itself from being asked. Instead, we tend to see the urban through its effects, suggesting that if we had to pinpoint it, the urban is the inevitable outcome of some naturalized transhistorical capacity of the human condition. It's just something we humans do. When it's interrogated as a concept, it all too often remains a partial notion, a quasi-category that seems insufficient in itself and requires some kind of supplementary conceptual framework for it to speak with any consequence. Indeed, there's a disturbingly tautological character found in much of urban theory today. In other words, the closer it gets to confronting its fundamental object, the urban, the more its collective response seems to be that what's really missing is simply the right adjective to describe it, or the right mode of analysis to assess its effects. And what's interesting to me is to question where this kind of ideological certainty about this category comes from. So I've talked about this in the past, calling it the sort of burden of the present. And really where this comes from, I think you can sort of sketch it out if we kind of do a quick examination of the canon of urban theory, if you want. And maybe starting with Ernst Burgess's sort of concentric model that he made in 1925 in his essay called The Growth of the City. Basically, he's proposing that cities grow according to these kind of concentric loops of different zones. And he's looking at this as an abstract model, but he's really studying Chicago in that sense. And so what he proposes gets kind of understood as this metropolitan urbanization, this sort of center-periphery model, in a way, comes from this. But of course, very soon after this, we start seeing other processes that are happening at other scales. So suddenly it's not metropolitan urbanization, but it's regional urbanization. Then, of course, that gets superseded and is now super-regional urbanization and mega-regional urbanization and so on. And soon the metropolis gets replaced by something else that is called, that John Gottman calls the Megalopolis, right? It's something that goes beyond those boundaries of familiarity and it therefore needs another name. And of course, beyond that, we start seeing other terms, megalopolis, post-metropolis, exopolis, Ed Soja's terminology. And more recently, not that recent, but not that far away either, Ricky Burdett and the London School of Economics, we start seeing publications like The Endless City, and it's just full of facts that show us that the city is endless, basically. So it's a bit of a tautology. The Venice Biennale of 2006, also curated by Ricky Burdett, was very fascinated with the notion of density and made a kind of a spectacle out of it. And this line of thinking has led to what's been called the urban age. Right? So this kind of sense of inevitability is built into this, even the title of this program. More recently, we have a project called the City of 7 Billion, which again is a kind of sort of a reimagining of all of the various cities around the world as if they're one city. And we have more and more of these kinds of models that are talked about and compared and contrasted. So in a sense, what we can say about this, all these various models based on their metrics, their sort of methods of measurement and so on, are capturing a process that's seemingly getting bigger and bigger and needs newer lenses through which to describe it. And in a way, what that says is the urban is somehow ahistorical. It's a matter of kind of measuring it in its present and projecting it into the future. And we see this also in things like population growth, so the sense of a process moving forward. And if it's somehow an ahistorical, or if history is only relevant in terms of projecting a curve forward, we can also say that the urban itself is apolitical. It's something that's just a product, a process that needs to be scientifically and quantitatively measured and theoretically then maybe assessed and so forth. And we can see how that then translates to techniques of ways to see the city in the kind of more contemporary sense. You have something like the Center for Urban Science and Progress in New York University, which is about trying to kind of use data and algorithmic kind of logics to somehow understand the city through a new lens, or MIT Sensible Cities, and so on and so forth. Lots of different ways in which epistemologically we're using this sort of immediate present to track as if it's like this constantly reshaping kind of space. And again, this also works its way into forms of governance in this kind of smart city kind of control rooms that are starting to pop up everywhere. Notions like Strickland's, the world is urbanized, let's design for it. Like, let's not think about it too much. This is the condition, just do your job, sort of. And so what do we do then in response? Again, we come back with, we invent always some kind of new adjective to describe some new technique of urbanism, and these go on and on. This is actually kind of an old list at this point, but we can surely quadruple this at this point. So just as much as the world may be urbanized, it's also a domain that's become ordered by networks of circulation. From the expansion of traditional infrastructures to global supply chain infrastructures, to the layering of planetary computational and ICT networks, circulation too seems to be the object of a certain ahistoricism. This, despite the fact that research into ideas proximate to circulation, such as the space of flows, logistics, mobility studies, and so on, has really blossomed of late. Though often loosely paired together in implicit association, the relationship between circulation and urbanization remains insufficiently examined. Instead, each one often appears as evidence of the other. Wherever infrastructures of circulation can be mapped, seems to indicate the de facto sites of urbanization. As a result, the urban remains as self-evident a category as it is vague, and circulation orbits perhaps too closely to the urban to invite critical reflection on the relation between the two. So the question is really, how do you move beyond this sort of impasse of this burden of the present, as I call it, a condition that urban theory still kind of tends to dwell, without then at the same time falling into the trap of theorizing some kind of universal model, which is also not something I have an interest in doing. So in other words, how can we understand the urban historically without flattening it into a kind of constant background of history? So one thing is that when we look to history to explain our fascination with the urban today, we'll find a wealth of clues that point to the 19th century as a sort of moment of consistent change in the space of the European and American city. So thinking of literature and art and so forth, as well as to sort of back up this kind of cultural shift. So from the side of architecture, which probably most of you are familiar with, this comes in a sort of narrative of the so-called modern city, whose departure from the Baroque, Renaissance, medieval, or classical cities is explained away by a kind of historical inquiry interested in epochs, periods, and styles, each of which reveals itself in its stylistic consistencies, and which can, in turn, be neatly cleaved from one another. From the side of geography and sociology, we have a depiction of a similar radical transformation of the city that you can find from those which accompany a kind of fully unfolding of a now dominant mode of capitalist production, so kind of a Marxian lens typically to explain this, and the various analysis that looks to trace these new social relations as they occupy new formations in space. So we're fairly, I think, familiar with these kinds of things. But for me, in both cases, the notion of circulation seems to revolve closely around the discoveries that articulate each history's portrait of a new type of city born in the 19th century. Again, generally in Europe, these books are looking. And of course, we could add to this the sort of radical cultural shifts accounted for by countless examples in modern literature, art, social practices, political struggles, and so on. But I think these are significant discoveries, but enforcing them through some kind of pre-existing frame of analysis, they might miss a certain point, which is to say that perhaps what all of our histories of modern urbanization or of the modern city, of modern town planning, however we want to talk about it, all show us is that there's something kind of radically new emerging in the world that needs to be named and understood differently. So my contention here then is if we are to get closer to knowing the urban, it will be by historically situating its appearance in the world. In other words, we may need a new kind of history theory, let's say, a kind of combination of history theory of the urban. So what does that mean then? And where would we start? So this is appears on the frontispiece of Ildefonso Cerda's sort of massive treatise, the Teoría General de la Urbanización, the general theory of urbanization. And it translates as ruralize the urban, urbanize the rural, fill the earth. And this appeared in 1867 when it was published. And I think it captures a sort of intoxicated zeal with which Cerda sought to kind of persuade his colleagues that he had really discovered not a new type of city, but rather a system for the co-organization of life and infrastructure that would actually do away with the city altogether. In its place, a sort of, sorry, it's the frontispiece here, in its place, an edgeless, centerless grid of fluid circulation and administered domesticity would extend across the earth, accommodating a calculated distribution of population and services. The urbe, as he called it, was indeed not a city at all, but rather a template on which to constitute new relations between life and technology, nature and capital, justice and subjectivity, territory, private property, movement, and security. Not only would the urbe displace the city, it was a medium that would, by its very spatio-technical disposition alone, render the state and politics altogether redundant. This was a very utopian project. And those who have ventured into Cerda's kind of rambling and somewhat hyperbolic teoria, and in most cases his writings in general, tend to kind of overlook these central objectives, likely dismissing them as the kind of byproducts of his somewhat self-congratulatory and unbounded sense of positivism. Instead, readers of his work seem more intent on uncovering those more familiar lines of thought that then in turn reaffirm the history of modernist urbanism. So Cerda is often celebrated for his ideas that we are told predate those of prominent figures like Corbusier, Hilberseimer, Konstantinos Doxiadis, and even early kind of urban cyberneticians, placing him as this kind of unproblematic figure in the well-established canon, and everything is all well and good. The two most dominant narratives that have emerged around Cerda today, or more recently, let's say, ignore his theoretical work almost entirely. Urban designers view his 1859 Eixample, the plan that everyone I'm sure is well aware of in Barcelona, as a kind of paradigm now of not only modern urbanism, but sustainable urbanism. And this template is often used when, or at least it was about 10 years ago for a lot of urban projects that were meant to be sustainable. And architectural and urban historians often celebrate this rather than his writings as evidence that Cerda was the sort of socially conscious houseman, you know. So while such readings of his work are no doubt useful, I think they cover over a far more profound and challenging and even like intersectional reading, one that's increasingly relevant today as contemporary discourses circle ever closer to questions of the urban. Admittedly, Cerda's claims to have single-handedly invented urbanización, which is in fact the term he invented, are both remarkable and easily dismissible. Yet the copious pages and volumes he devoted to describing this process and the order of space it produces perhaps deserve a closer, more interpretive attention. For what they reveal, I want to argue, is not so much an invention, let's say, as a kind of careful documentation of sorts of a truly new order of space coming into being, to which Cerda is actually more of a witness. So he doesn't invent it, but he's somehow seeing this thing coming about and believing that he's actually inventing it. You know, a lot of discoveries happen, I think, right? Indeed, between his abundant statistical mapping of his contemporary city and his exhaustive theorization of a planetary urbe to come, Cerda's many theories do more to describe a logic, to describe the logic of and social, political, legal, and economic relations of a real spatial order that he sees emerging all across Europe, than to prescribe it in its concrete specificity. Text, statistical analysis, mathematical formula, and speculative spatial diagrams together articulate the emergence of urbanization in what could be the world's first theoretical account of a space process that has today encircled the planet. Indeed, it may be that Cerda's writings, diagrams, calculations, plans, and policies all stand as a kind of a network of objects that speaks to an order of space new to the world in the 19th century. A set of artifacts that reveals, in other words, that urbanization may actually have a history. So just very quickly to kind of sketch out how this teoria is structured, it was 2 massive volumes, almost 1,500 pages in length, divided into 4 books, so the origins of urbanization, development of urbanization, analytical examination of the actual state of urbanization, and historical philosophical raison d'etre of actual urbanization. Roughly speaking, and again, very roughly speaking, we can sort of cut this in half and see this as, on one side, a sort of history, and I say history here because it's a sort of prehistoric history, this kind of appeal to the savage, let's say, or original kind of human being. And then on the other side, a kind of diagram for how to recover these origins into a future program. So in other words, urbanization is natural, and the only way to kind of recover that nature is to express it through a kind of science. So maybe we might accord this to today's distinction between urbanization and urbanism in the sense. So he doesn't use the word urbanism, and that doesn't come around until, I believe, early 20th century. So at the center of his theory of urbanization is this concept he calls vialidad, or in a sense, unlimited, this kind of almost theological concept of movement. This is significant in a number of ways. For one, it marked the beginning of a pattern that would be repeated by nearly every urbanist since then. Circulation from the mid-19th century onward would occupy the core of both the knowledge of the city and the practices of processes of its reproduction. More than this, by making circulation a kind of precondition of the city, which he does, it would fundamentally transform it altogether. In other words, for Cerda, it was from this point on that the city, a kind of spatially fixed, historically rooted, and for him a very politically overdetermined entity, would become effectively eclipsed by something entirely different, which is, of course, the urbe. And not only would the urbe replace the city, but it would subsume all previous spaces of human settlement, replacing it with a deliberately generic, universal space whose process of self-expansion, or urbanization that we would say, would eventually unite the entire planet into a single interconnected urbe. So the idea of planetary urbanization was already somehow there. So again, to explain what this urbe is, first, this question of vialidad as a sort of historical force, kind of a measuring stick, really, for all of human history for Cerda, breaks history down into kind of phases determined entirely for Cerda by the sort of dominant mode of movement, thus what is foundational for each kind of phase along the way. The idea is that he sort of, as this becomes more of a science then, what his primary task then in the emerging future of the 19th century was really to kind of create a new network of ways, a new system of circulation, and then from there the urban would unfold. So he creates this, what he calls the sort of network of ways, which is constituted through what he calls not streets, but links and nodes instead of intersections. So at every moment, he's renaming these elements that are within every part of the city. And at the center of this, once he's somehow kind of gotten to the end of these various technologies, let's say, that he discovers along the way, he realizes suddenly that the spaces left over are these kind of what he calls intervias, right? The things in between the ways. In other words, where people live, domestic architecture, let's say. And so this is sort of the end product that's at the end, but when he starts to realize that not only is this the most important part, but it's also an urbe in miniature. And he starts to almost describe this space as a scaleless space, something that can be kind of fractally reproduced at any scale. And that was kind of an intention of his. And if this is the case, that this new space would be kind of marching out across the entire world, uniting it in one, and part of that was to kind of do away with the distinction between the city and the rural. It necessarily meant, as the frontispiece says, that he had to ruralize the urban and urbanize the rural. What he called ruralized urbanization was something that this new urbe would actually incorporate both spaces in one. So it was not urban or rural, it was both. And so this idea of ruralized urbanization would consist of two primary elements, right? The network of ways and the intervias, this kind of simplified, ultra-reductive diagram, let's say, of this new space to come. And from this, we can start to see that on the one hand, the urban was a kind of a space in which that would need to distribute property and start to sort of transform territory into kind of units that could be consumed by the private individual, the sort of liberal subject that's emerging of capitalism. And from that, we can start to see how the urban or an urbanization acts as a kind of spatial datum for life. It's meant to be something that reconstitutes life as a series of processes, a series of movements between dwelling and a sort of biological restitution of the human being, and also being out in the network of ways and moving. And one of the very interesting moves that he makes is to define density not as a sort of number of people per unit of space, but rather the amount of urbe per person. So it's kind of an inversion that somehow speaks to the way that he saw this as not only a way to reconstruct space, but also to reconstruct the human being as a body. But of course, for that, it also, the other side of it was that it was very much playing into new networks of capitalism, and that this machine of human beings, this sort of biological machine, was also an economic machine, and therefore the network of ways was prescribed and really kind of overridden with lots of regulations about how one moves. And so just to sort of understand how this idea of circulation, which was meant to be this sort of expression of ultimate freedom, in the end, it kind of started to get pared down into this space of absolute control of again, the sort of bioeconomic individual that would circulate through it. And we can start to see that in this section. If we analyze his writings, what's happening is we have a kind of, this above and below, two different types of vialidad, right? This sort of below ground, which would deal with everything that is to preserve the life of the domestic space, whereas the street was meant to sort of be this experience of the enhancement of life, a new sort of experience of life as sort of capitalist subjects moving effortlessly around the world. And so in that space, we have this incredible sort of regulation of behaviors, these controls about how to move where and where to stop and where to pull over, literally, as a human moving through the streets. While on the other side, we have a kind of, the domestic sphere becomes for the first time the site of a huge kind of and permanent administration, managing the relationships between not only different units, but also the relations within a given unit. So we really have a space that also starts to divide itself across the lines of production, as in sort of capitalist production and reproduction, or we could say reproductive labor, unwaged labor as well, and so on. We could start to have other discussions. But this divide, it really starts to kind of operate along these lines, where the space of the street, the collective space, is actually really for the individual. It's meant to be a kind of completely atomized, sort of unbounded, moving person, whereas the space of domesticity is actually the site in which the population is kind of realized as this sort of biological category that needs its own forms of control. So I'm going quickly through this, of course, but furthermore, again, he's obsessed with overturning all these kinds of previous inherited oppositions. So the public-private, city, landscape, state, society, interior, exterior. And in a sense, the mission of the urbe is to do that exactly in each of these cases. It's kind of a machine that responds in reaction to these things, where the public-private sort of would be overturned by creating this single economic and domestic sphere. The city versus landscape or nature outside would be overturned by this notion of ruralized urbanization, which would incorporate both. State and society would be somehow overcome by doing away with the state and replacing it with this kind of administrative, bureaucratic kind of machine, let's say. An interior, exterior, the notion that the city was now encompassing the entire planet sort of did away again with that as well. So I claim that it's precisely within the notion of vialidad that a specifically modern political form would be born. On its surface, urbanization would embrace the new technologies of communication and transportation to announce the dawn of a bloodless revolution, the awakening of a world in which universal peace would be achieved by connecting the whole of society in a single continuous process of urbanization. A world in which the management of infrastructure alone would render defunct the political abstractions of times past. However, an urban world founded on unlimited circulation is, of course, not a world free from the political, obviously quite the contrary. If urbanization for Cerda was a means to dismantle the remnants of the absolute power of the state, it nevertheless does so by reconstituting power in the image of the urban itself. And this is what Cerda didn't, of course, recognize. Creating a paternalistic provider of services whose face would disintegrate into the formless web of roads, rails, and sewage pipes. More than that, in an urbanized world, the modern discovery of freedom that Cerda was so intent on would find its purpose in precisely what the state previously had prohibited, unencumbered movement. Yet this freedom, I argue, could only be experienced by binding life to countless new apparatuses, spatial technologies of immunization and systems of control, all of whose power is predicated on their ability to circulate. I think we sort of have an idea of what that might look like today when things like facial recognition technologies and sort of cybernetic technologies that somehow manage and watch us, let's say, as we move through the space. So just to sort of conclude about the teoria, I argue in total that the urbe must be seen as a kind of apparatus that specifies a spatio-technical organization of life in coordination with a machinic governmental network of knowledge and techniques deployed to manage it, all built around a new kind of entrepreneurial, property-owning subject of capitalism that Cerda embraced as the core of his new ideal society that the urbe then would help to bring about. Cerda's efforts to depoliticize the city, replacing it with a non-representational, infinitely domestic, administered and economic space of private property and capitalist circulation, as his own writings reveal, only end up redirecting and indeed expanding the purchase of the political through new channels, spaces, and technologies that bind themselves to the very conditions and processes of life itself. And precisely because Cerda's theory of urbanization is more of an idealization of emergent conditions of his time than a pioneering departure from them, his work, more than anyone else's, reveals a tremendous amount about this subtle new relationship forged between the emergent urban space and the political, one that I would say still persists today. So this is my kind of assessment of Serda's work, but the question then is, where do we go from here? Because obviously he's not the inventor of this space, perhaps. Certainly, Serda might reveal a lot about what we call the urban. His work is really just kind of the opening into a broader examination of this space process. And by itself, we can imagine how this research could plug into existing frameworks of urban analysis, in each case expanding their discursive hold on our present imaginaries of the city, urbanization, and planetary infrastructures. It certainly might fit into a kind of Marxian analysis of modern urbanization and so on, and I kind of will go quickly for this. It also might develop a line of thought that explores technologies and techniques that accompany and make possible the rise of what Michel Foucault has called biopower and its kind of attendant strategies of biopolitics that some of you might be familiar with. So housing, infrastructure, communication technologies, administrative apparatuses, new legal structures, bylaws, and so on, all might help to make this shift visible in the spaces of the 19th century city by revealing a network of kind of knowledge power, as Foucault might call it, that somehow makes life live and lets it die. Again, paraphrasing Foucault for those who know his work. And I think, to be sure, my work works across both of these registers of kind of acknowledging both an analysis of capital and an analysis of new emergent modes of biopower that were happening in the 19th century in Europe. However, both frames by themselves tend to presuppose a form of investigation that proceeds from the later 18th century or early 19th century up to the present, right? So if a kind of historical investigation is needed at all. And since the historical foundations upon which each frame is built are well known, established political histories and critiques and so on. But neither of these frameworks is particularly well suited to postulate something about the urban or what this might even mean to situate its historical emergence more broadly. Nevertheless, also a problem persists. If in our own kind of discoveries about modern urbanization, we also discover that the urban itself is a unique, fundamentally irreducible space that first appears in the 19th century, as I argue, then it may simply be no longer sufficient to analyze urbanization through some prefigured discursive framework, nor to spend time debating which framework is best for understanding contemporary urban processes, spaces, or power structures. Rather, what I think we need, and what I try to propose in my book, is a new way into the problem altogether. So what might we discover if we take the question of space, architecture, infrastructure, and in general, the ways in which we organize matter and bodies in the world as a place to begin to question power itself? What if, rather than merely treating space, architecture, infrastructure, and material as objects that, through some critical analysis, confirm or refute various existing socio-political economic analyses? What if, instead, these objects open ways for us to see how power composes itself? In other words, what if unexplored questions about the constitution of power may be found in a history of space and its organization? This is the sort of larger conceit of my project, I think. Well, obviously too broad to begin to address as such, a history of circulation is nevertheless revealing. For one, it offers a way in which to trace a certain persistent relation between the ideals and objectives of power and the spaces realized to achieve them throughout sort of histories. The history of circulation is one that tends to be tied to long-standing structures of power, despite that we tend to think of it as something that, especially in urban and architectural discourse, that somehow becomes important only in the 19th century. It's actually much longer than that, and its ties to power much older. Extending from systems of divinity to early modern statecraft, to maritime discourses of trade, and to the administration of Europe's colonial and imperial spaces, and so on. In short, circulation, we could say, constitutes a more general nexus between various political orders and their correlating spaces, one that can be traced actually across history. So from this point of view, the analysis I make looks at the urban as a spatial correlate of a form of power whose particular configuration cohered over the course of the 19th century. In other words, by asking about the history of the bond between circulation and political power, we might be able to view urbanization as a particular expression and mode of power in a larger genealogy of the relationship between circulation, power, and spatial order, if that makes sense. So if a bond between modern power and circulation can indeed be located within the urban, this then opens up to asking if such a coupling can be found elsewhere in history, right? So in spaces outside of the city, perhaps. So what other figures of space did this relationship give rise to before? How is it that the city maybe would eventually become the key site in which this complex could take root in the 19th century? So by reading on the history of circulation in relation to forms of power, I try to at once depict the urban as a historically recent spatial order, while also allowing the political character of its otherwise domestic infrastructural spaces to be exposed as augmented, entangled technologies of a kind of particular modern form of power, the nature of which, as I'll try to show, extends well beyond what a kind of Foucauldian or Marxian frame can reveal then in themselves. So what I try to show is that the relation between circulation and the modern city or modern town planning, as we know of it through architectural history, is actually not that novel, despite what our histories tell us, nor is its relation to the structure of modern power anything conceptually particularly new. So this then opens up a second and crucial trajectory. If in the first instance, the urban can be examined as an apparatus, again borrowing from Foucault, so biopolitics, capitalism, and so on, a second line of inquiry results from seeing the urban as a historically contingent form, one that's not transhistorically equivalent to the city, but specifically bound up with the reorganization of life in the 19th century. In this sense, we can understand the urban as a kind of political technology. So this second trajectory forces us to treat its 19th century emergence not as a kind of origin, but quite the opposite. It forces us instead to trace its becoming across centuries of spatial, political, and social experimentation that led up to its kind of culmination in the 19th century. So the book documents the ways in which circulation as a concept was made useful for giving order to the physical world. So very quickly, I just go through this. Doing so requires, in a sense, that we trace not only the emergence of circulation as a concept in the 16th century natural philosophy, but to understand how it derived from a long-standing perception across the ancient world in which the circle had given visibility to divine, cosmological, and sort of natural orders, and thus was a dominant signature of a pre-modern form of power, marking out the divinely ordained human world in contrast to the natural world outside of it. By tracing the metamorphosis from celestial signature to a kind of a rational concept, we can reveal how in its conceptual form, circulation would prove to be one of the most important spatial principles from which a new sphere of earthly, economic, and political power might be imagined at one point in time. So into the 17th century, again in Europe, circulation permeated scientific, political, and spatial thought, establishing itself as a concept central to the emerging knowledge and techniques of things like territory, and at the same time to discourses governing the new networks of Atlantic trade in Europe's imperial spaces and colonial territories. While both adopted divergent understandings of circulation through which their respective spaces could be imagined, their shared investment in the foundational truth, let's say, of this concept, as well as the sort of intimate relation it formed with early modern forms of power, cannot be denied. Thus, circulation before its entry into the city served as a fundamental role in the history of territory, constituting simultaneously a central idea, an objective, and a technique. Territory, as Stuart Eldon argues, is a political technology. Within the space of territory, I explore the emergence of a new knowledge and architecture mobilized to literally reconstruct its landscape as a fluid space of controlled circulation and to materialize its borders in a series of fortified cities. With the developments of territory in this period, we can also chart the changing status of the city within its disciplined space of securitized, calculated movement that territory had provided. Nested and interconnected sites of coordinated productivity, cities, towns, and villages also began revealing themselves to be both a practical and an epistemological problem. The city, no longer understood through its separation from the natural world outside, appeared instead as a kind of hierarchical element, both within and in opposition to the vast spaces of circulation of the territory. The city, in a sense, had become increasingly inefficient, so especially by the 18th century, a lot of discussions were happening. Somehow unable in its spatial organization to cope with the state's new demands for circulation at many levels. And while certain state reason had formed itself in conjunction with the knowledge of territory, superimposing its rationality onto the landscape as a kind of geometry of calculated, controlled, and measured movement, the city could only respond to the same demands by instituting measures like the police. I take this epistemological divide, in a sense, between city and territory as constitutive of a foundational crisis which would not be overcome until well into the 19th century with the birth of the urban. Yet much more than a kind of solution to the problem, the urban, as I try to show, is not a kind of, not as a form of knowledge born in the spaces of the city, but rather as a kind of technology that arrived as a modified form of territorial knowledge. So in other words, by examining the city as a sort of historical object in relation to the political technology of territory, we can show the formation of the urban was conditioned almost exclusively by the epistemologies of movement discovered not in the city, but in the geometrical spaces of territory. I look at how St. Simonian thought provided the ground for this application of territorial knowledge to the space of the city through Michel Chevalier's innovative reinterpretation of the concept of réseau, or network, as this kind of universal principle that he saw that would kind of order spaces across all scales. One which would also subsequently reinterpret territory itself. In doing so, I try to show how the countless narratives of Haussmann's reconstruction of Paris that hopefully we're all familiar with, I suppose, have largely kind of missed the specifically territorial significance of his superimposition of a network system onto a kind of homogeneous city of quartier and so on. So these images are probably very familiar to you. And we think of this as kind of a modernization process. What I'm trying to argue is that this is exactly the imposition of a territorial logic onto the spaces of the city. So these kind of, at this point, radically new spaces begin to emerge, and this kind of new experience of the city as a territorial object at this point. So while Haussmann's work is, of course, of great historical importance, with regard to the birth of the urban or its capacity as a paradigm that can shed light on contemporary modes of urbanization, I believe it has its limits. Indeed, when placed in dialogue with Cerda, we begin to see a deeper epistemological set of contours that his project responded to. To fully understand the entrance of territorial techniques into the thought and planning of the city, and indeed planning itself is a technique of territory, the book finally turns its attention back to Cerda, examining how his critical appraisal of Haussmann's work led him to conclude that no reform to a city could happen without the appropriate and proportionate expansion, all of which would require a kind of highly systematic, scientific, spatio-governmental apparatus. So the 5 bases of urbanization, as he's somewhat famous for. If urbanization for Cerda was a simultaneous process of reform and extension, as he called for this plan of Barcelona of 1859, then I show how both sides of this process were informed by 2 interrelated forms of territorial knowledge, one forged in the spaces of European state, so carving through, disciplining the landscape, and on the other, drawing from a model of colonial settlement, actually, in the Americas. Through Cerda's inspiration from Philadelphia, I placed this city's history in particular light, showing how it not only coordinated a system of territorial production with proto-urban, if you want, space, but how it also tellingly inspired an entire tradition of systematic appropriation, distribution, and production of the so-called empty spaces of the Americas, most notably Jefferson's Land Ordinance of 1785. So in this way, we can find many epistemological overlaps between it and Cerda's Urbe. Tellingly, Cerda realized late in life that another word for urbanization was actually colonization. So to conclude, if we approach the urban from this trajectory, I believe we can understand it to be not any longer a kind of transhistorical concept, but rather an entirely new spatial order, one which bears an epistemology that was discovered not in the spaces and architectural forms of the city, but rather in the knowledge, practices, and experiences of territory, drawing along with its own historical relations to maritime space and colonial techniques of territorializing the so-called New World. The thread that strings all of these figures together for me is circulation. In total, the book that I've published is really is an attempt to reveal the urban as a historically situated spatio-political order in its own right, a kind of political technology that first became legible and reproducible in the course of the 19th century in Europe, but whose genealogy spans across centuries-old figures and disparate world spaces. I argue that this space materialized as an anonymous parallel project of the restructuring of the space of the emergent liberal nation state. More than simply a reflection of this new state form or the kind of product of its capitalist relations that it fostered, the urban, I argue, should instead be seen as a kind of primary instrument of both, at once means and ends. While drawing together ideas, truths, figures, and fragments of knowledge from across history, it was only in the 19th century that there emerged a kind of cohesive, legible, and reproducible way by which to imagine and organize space, institute modes of inhabitation, conceive of infrastructures of movement and control, instrumentalize domesticity, reconstitute labor, public life, social practices, law, and even the status of the human being itself, all of which, for me, concretize in this new order of space. By approaching Cerda in this way, we can see that while conditioning nearly all spatial dimensions of the urbe, his use of network and the conceptual centrality that circulation occupied, or vialidad, are more than simply principles of design. Rather, they must be seen together as a kind of signature of the reorganization of political power in space. By building itself as an expandable network rather than a kind of finite spatial entity, what results is a sort of hybrid spatiality. The urban emerges as both territory and city, while being neither at the same time, a space somehow in excess of both ontologies. This history of circulation reveals a somewhat quiet, yet historically consistent accomplice in kind of common denominator between the various spatial distinctions and political orders that have structured and restructured the Western world since at least the 16th century. From enclosed territories to colonial spaces across land and sea, from global empires to an urbanized planet, it is circulation that seems to constantly open up a historical geography of power, less interested in the essentialized qualities of land or sea, city or countryside, but rather in the abstract logics of modern power that cut across both. This is even more pressing to recognize today, precisely because any relationship between circulation and political power may to many seem accidental or oblique. And I just finished by saying that while today we debate the veracity of distinctions like rural and urban, or as we confront the tenuous notions of limits and scale, as we contemplate new epistemic understandings of the city, as we theorize provocations like the urbanization of the oceans, as we question the status of nature in the face of endlessly emerging megacities, or as we lament the atrophy of the public realm and the incursion of governmental surveillance into private space, as we question the urban as a site of administration and control, or as we dissect the politics of domesticity, infrastructure, and territory, and gasp at the planetary reach of the urban systems they constitute, it is perhaps useful to critically examine the discoveries of Serdar, whose work, perhaps unintentionally, lends tremendous insight into all of these facets that we experience in the shifting, scaleless ways in which space presents itself today. Cutting through its rampant hyperbole, Serdar's work offers a theoretical description of the processes and spaces that he no doubt observes unfolding across Europe in the mid-19th century, an account which he extrapolates in diagrammatic lucidity in his proposals for a single regulated spatial order of domesticity and movement to encircle the globe. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks. Thanks so much. Super interesting. And we have time for questions. I want to ask actually first question. So you defined your project as a kind of history-theory of the urban, right?
I guess so.
Yeah. So I wonder if you could elaborate or expand a little bit on this in terms of methodologies, methods, but also in relation to institutional, how should I put it, institutional division of academic labor. Right?
Yeah, this is something we've had a couple chats about. Yeah, I think it's a good question, because the way that typically we approach history in architecture as a discipline is very much through the centrality of the figure of the archive, right? We, tend to, as a profession, and it's very professionalized, I would say, we tend to find a kind of an archive that hasn't necessarily been sort of exposed, and that hopefully has some kind of relationship to questions and debates in the present. And there's some really obviously valuable work in that. What becomes somehow excluded from that exploration, though, are questions about that archive that maybe where, let's say, other histories, other ideas kind of cut through that archive or expose it to other processes that are somehow, obviously by definition, outside of it. And there's something of this kind of professionalization of history that forbids those kinds of questions. So yes, we have a very sort of strong tradition in architectural history. And on the other side, something like theory seems, again, to be much more bound up with the present. It has to be about explaining something that's unfolding at the moment. Whether that's like the global cities or whatever it might be, it tends to forbid, again, as I sort of mentioned earlier, like the asking of questions of how this is historically constituted. So I feel like, I don't know exactly, maybe it's more of a genealogical approach that I have, or a kind of concept historical approach, but it somehow tries to interrogate history differently, like kind of transversely.
Thanks.
Also, just to say that a lot of disciplines that we sort of tend to think are absolute today are really not necessarily, and more questions that we're asking today demand that we kind of not adhere to those as much. And also the history of discourses is also not one of disciplines that are parceled out.
Yes, yeah.
Hi. So the way you kind of described the urbanization and it seemed to me, if I understood correctly, you kind of emphasized the machine-like structure or the top-down political technology imposing the kind of not very natural structure on top of landscapes and so on. But at the same time, it is possible to look at the city, of course, as an organism and
Yes.
or ecology where the circulation is very natural thing and so on. And also, if you look at all these road networks and so on, they, at some scale, they are very kind of similar to physical networks. They optimize certain physical parameters and so on. So in this view, urbanization is kind of still very natural and quite inevitable process, not so much about top-down imposing. So I'm wondering, is this view kind of the opposite of your view, or are they compatible, or?
Wait, sorry, what's inevitable that you said? The one, like seeing...
The urbanization process, basically, because it's kind of the similar process that is happening also in the natural world with, I mean, single-cell organisms getting multicellular and so on.
Yeah.
And ant nests and whatever.
Well, I guess that's, in a way, what I'm trying to sort of question is how inevitable and natural is it? And I guess this also depends on what we mean by natural and so on, which I wouldn't myself want to speculate, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also a question that this, also this distinction between top-down and bottom-up that we use. I mean, it's often very useful to use that. In this case, I think what Serda shows, and what I think a lot of scholarship at people like Foucault and so on have exposed, is that it's never top-down or bottom-up, but it's maybe both or something else. That this kind of space, this machinic space that I describe with Serda's, is something that is something that manages conduct, if you want to use, again, Foucauldian terminology. I'm not bound to that necessarily, but that the sort of controls and regulations and so forth are not imposed directly by like a sovereign figure, let's say, but they come in sort of administrative, invisible levels in which it's the control of flows rather than the kind of prohibition of flows, let's say. But yes, of course, you know, if we go on Google Earth or something and we see this, you know, from 3 miles up in the sky or whatever, yes, it has a sort of natural look. And I mean, we can speculate as to why, you know, that is, and why roads, you know, bend around as if formed by nature. I suppose I'm not necessarily so interested in that question. It's more just to sort of actually destabilize those questions in a way to show that what, you know, Serda was trying to create something that was itself natural, right? This was all about creating a grid, but nevertheless a very kind of rigid grid that would go across the entire world, across oceans as well. So I guess it troubles those distinctions between natural and artificial.
Thanks.
Thank you for the super interesting talk. I'm wondering about the Serda's grid that was applied, and now the current changes happening in Barcelona, where they're implementing more of those one-way street to leave more space for the pedestrians, or the super blocks where we were cutting the circulation away. I'm wondering, was that anyhow also reflected in a theoretical part that now is somehow emerging, or is it totally contradicting this?
Anticipated by Serda in a sense?
Yeah.
No, not that I've come across. I mean, he was very absolute, and you know, his idea of the city and of urbanization is a very reductive image in a sense. It's you know, this kind of well, whatever, this works, I guess. And for him, it was absolute, that it had to sort of be this kind of march of this exact kind of block with the variations that he nevertheless built into it. So he actually, okay, maybe that's a better way to say it. From the other side, a lot of critique of this plan was that it was too rigid and too homogeneous. And in fact, you could argue that the variations that he built into it, the distribution and turning just the block 90 degrees and the variations of the block structures would actually give a high degree of variability. And a lot of kind of pro-Serda scholars and so forth that have come out recently have advocated that very thing. So probably the answer to the sort of livable city Serda is he would have liked it. Serda 2.0 maybe, I don't know. But yeah, there's nothing in his writings that says like, and we'll make super blocks and so forth.
Thanks for the talk as well. I really enjoyed the book. I quite liked the different scales and how you try to expand this to a sort of totalistic account of what we are in right now. So I would like to add maybe two terms to your equation.
Oh,
so
good.
you took urbanism and added this concept of circulation. So it may be like to ask you, what if you add capital and environment
Yes.
currently? So if you look at the 19th century quite specifically, and then it could be simplistically said that the need to accelerate circulation and the kind of urban environment we have now is quite directly tied to the needs of capital,
Yes.
of accelerating past limits of nature, this possibility to circulate capital.
Yes, no doubt.
And then the current situation of the environmental crisis, then what do you see the role of circulation being in the context of urban or
In a contemporary
or,
sense.
Yeah.
or-
Is it going
Yeah.
to keep accelerating? Do we
Like,
need another
what is my
technology?
prognosis of the future?
Kind of. No, I'm just wondering, like, if you're saying that you're stating that we are in a total urbanized way now, and
Well-
circulation has been a constant throughout.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would hesitate to say that we're in a total urbanized place. I mean, I think, for example, Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt, the theory of planetary urbanization, sort of hints to that. And, there are arguments to say that, at a sort of epistemological level, yes, we live in a kind of completely urbanized space, maybe, but I'm not sure that that would necessarily do us any good. I think what I guess I'm trying to highlight out of this is that there is this sort of epistemological background condition, let's say, almost environmental in that sense, that allows us to sort of see this as a natural process and just to sort of assume it as a background to life, and that we simply need to modify it and tune it so that it becomes more sustainable and resilient and so on. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of how that then relates to, well, also just to say, like, for that reason, I don't think that there are spaces that are not outside of the urban, that everything is, subsumed to this logic. It's simply an exaggeration that doesn't really take us very far. But in terms of the environment, I mean, I think, yes, it's definitely a concern that really drove me into this field in general, and then to eventually start to think about this, because if we are going to think about, climate change, we should probably think a little bit about what we do in urbanizing stuff. And again, as I showed in the beginning, a lot of the projects that I worked on were exactly saying that, well, what we'll do is just build a new city, like a Masdar or whatever eco-city, and that somehow will be only 1.2 Earths instead of 1.8 Earths or whatever. It seems preposterous. And that does come back to capital as well, right? This financialized capital, is the need to attract capital in an age of instability and so forth.
Yeah, sorry, just to add that maybe if you think about the logic of capital, of the need of reinvestment and constant building, and that is in itself a form of circulation, right? Then, I mean, it's what sort of got us into this in the first place.
You're trying to out me as a communist?
No, maybe proclaim myself as one.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think that's the big question. It is absolutely tied to capitalism, and it's not to say that we can't imagine a similar kind of space, let's say, that is outside of capital, but it would require very different sort of networks of care, networks of maintenance, and so forth, that I think are, rather than rebuilding and building and reinvesting and so forth. But yeah, that's a huge question, obviously. I don't know if I can say much more about it.
Maybe I just follow up on So maybe could you expand a little bit on your reading of the neo-Marxian urban geography, the whole Lefebvrean kind of school, because and in a way it's really follow up on this question. So does circulation precede capitalism, or is the other way around? And if indeed circulation precedes capitalism, I mean, what? Is that, aren't you back in the kind of position that you criticized, our reading of urbanization of the urban as ahistorical. But aren't there? Yeah, but isn't it that now circulation is this trans-historical concept?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. I guess maybe it's not a trans-historical concept, because a trans-historical idea is something that stays somehow consistent throughout time. I think what I'm interested more in is the consistent relationship circulation has with truth. Like, it seems to somehow constantly speak to various forms of truth. What changes are those truth structures. What circulation confirms every time is something very different. So at one point in time, it confirms the sort of divinely ordained, structure or power of God and the sort of Christian subject, let's say, which gets reproduced in countless kinds of circular architectures and spaces and symbols. And what it confirms later as a sense of truth is the truth of the circulation of capital, again, confirmed also by science at that point. So I think it's more of something that is a useful marker of, not as a trans-historical concept, it's not, it changes, but it's something that speaks, that binds, that creates relationships, or makes legible, let's say, relationships that otherwise wouldn't be so visible. Maybe that makes sense.
I'm a bit reluctant to ask this question because I worry I maybe at the risk of trivializing the genealogy, but I feel that it's very much rooted in a modern apparatus of power, and therefore also modern subjectivities of power. And so, and then therefore this kind of like liberal logic of circulation of capital and so on. But then I wonder about this neoliberal logic. And I think precisely in that how now it's capital must flow, but people do not flow. And so you have Trump with his wall, you have Brexit, you have so on. And so, yeah, I wonder how you feel about it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if I would have so much insight to say, but I think you've kind of said it. It is capital that must flow. It is finance. It's more abstract capital that must flow, which I suppose comes at the detriment of people flowing. I think the ideal of Serda is all about people moving, because people are the carriers of capital, right? So that for this to work, and of course, he's not thinking of everyone. He's thinking of men, white Spanish men, pretty much. And every bourgeois subject in the world that wants to somehow unite into the space. In fact, there's a really interesting set of chapters in the books that talk about the domestic space and how it's also like a very controlled space where the man goes to kind of contemplate and think about how he's going to go back out in the financial world the next day and whatever. And everything else is the woman's space of care and maintenance and so forth. So it's highly gendered, sexist kind of reading of space. But I suppose, again, this is all about also re-understanding this new kind of human being, this ideal bourgeois subject that is the carrier of capital. Today, it's not that. I mean, we have ICT networks and so forth that carry capital as an abstract thing, and therefore, really the fallout of a lot of, I mean, you could argue the fallout of capitalism is it forced dispossession of land and migration of people, forced migrations of people, that then spurs a kind of different type of circulation and a sort of an unwanted circulation for people like Trump and many others. So, yeah, I suppose maybe that's kind of just repeating what you said, basically. Oh yeah.
Maybe just one quick question, if sorry. No, I mean, because I'm really curious. How do you situate this type of place-making urbanisms? And the whole genealogy from Camilo Sitte through Jane Jacobs, Jan Gehl, and that type of urbanism in this framework. And because like very superficially, it seems that the argument that underpins this displacement approach is that it's also, it's kind of counter-circulation because it's about sitting down,
Right.
slowing down, enjoying your cappuccino and so on.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, how do you respond to or like situate that within your project?
Well, I think it's interesting to see that shift comes about at a moment again where it's not so much about it's less and less about capital flowing through the movement of bodies and physical infrastructures, and more through the rise of really the rise of finance capital is, I guess, around whenever the 60s or 70s, and you have a more bureaucratic kind of form of capitalism emerging in that sense. So I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily want to make a grand statement about that, but it feels like it's also reactionary against the great modernist projects and the sort of the Robert Moseses and the Corbusiers and so on, who are manifesting the city as a space only of circulation in a way, or a space that's so much designed toward those ends that, of course, we can cultivate a romantic approach for what was lost in that. But again, you can do that only because perhaps that's a moment when capital is becoming more, it's becoming possible to do so, right? And of course, it's also for whom are we talking about, right? Always the question of Jane Jacobs, and so forth, is that she's a fairly privileged bourgeois white woman, and it would be very different to imagine the same thing happening in a place like Harlem at the same time, and so on. So, yeah, don't know.
Any final question? Okay. Thank you, Ross. Thanks.
Thank you.